Hello and welcome today to this session on hypertension. This is session 4, and today we will be talking about high blood pressure. As always, we start the session with a quote, and this quote comes from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and it says, "The time is always right to do what is right." Now, when you do the session out into your community, I want you to read the quote that we have and then ask your community members what the quote means to them. Today, we're going to discuss high blood pressure and hypertension, and we will see that sometimes it is difficult to control our high blood pressure. Another name for high blood pressure that we will learn is hypertension. And we'll see that it could be difficult at times to control our high blood pressure due to some of the actions we would need to take, like decreasing our salt intake, avoiding alcohol, and those other things. It's challenging sometimes to implement what is the right way to live in terms of what we eat and how much we exercise. But as Martin Luther King says in this statement, it's always the right time to do what is right. And we should always look for those points in time that we can do better for ourselves and do make sure that we're doing what is right. So that's what the quote means to me. So I'll go ahead and get started by sharing my screen. And I'd like to just share what we have today for this program. So I usually ask that individuals read directly from their manual, and I will start that. I may switch to presenting using slides in just a few minutes, but I wanted to start with demonstrating that you should always use your manual. So as it says, today's session is about steps that you can take to control your blood pressure. The facts don't lie. High blood pressure increases your risk of getting heart disease and of having a stroke. The likelihood of having high blood pressure increases with age. About 1 in 5 adults with high blood pressure don't know that they have it. So high blood pressure is often called a silent killer. It's not like we will be able to necessarily feel that we have high blood pressure. You can have high blood pressure and not know it. Now, if your blood pressure got to a certain level, yes, sure, you might feel some symptoms such as headaches and other symptoms. But for the most part, you can have high blood pressure and there can be no way you can know it unless you take your blood pressure or you visit your doctor and allow them to take your blood pressure. There is a type of high blood pressure called preeclampsia, which happens only during pregnancy. If a woman has preeclampsia, then it doubles her risk of getting heart disease later in life. So as you go out and teach the manual into the community, you would definitely want to make your community members aware that there is this situation called preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy. And so if they had a pregnancy, they had high blood pressure during that pregnancy, and then after they gave birth, their blood pressure went down, they're still at risk of developing high blood pressure and heart disease later in life. So they need to be made aware of that risk factor. For most of us, high blood pressure and strokes are preventable. So there are steps that we can take in order to prevent high blood pressure. So now let's take a closer look at high blood pressure in the African American community. About 40% of African American adults have high blood pressure. Less than half of all African Americans with high blood pressure have it under control. So we not only have higher rates of high blood pressure in the African American community, as you can see, 40%. So if there were 10 of us in a room, then 4 of us would have high blood pressure. So that's a very significant burden of disease that we must talk to our community members about and educate them about. But of those individuals that have it, so we were in the room with 10 individuals and 4 of those individuals have high blood pressure, less than half of the African American population, or 2 out of that 4, would have it under control. such as taking blood pressure medication. African American women are also more likely to develop preeclampsia compared to white women, and 3 times more likely to die from it. So African American women are at a higher risk than white women of developing high blood pressure during pregnancy. And they're like 3 times more likely to die from that. African Americans are twice as likely to have a stroke as white Americans. We're also more likely to have strokes at younger ages and to have more severe strokes. So there's the double whammy here in that we are more likely to have high blood pressure, which can cause strokes. We're more likely to have the strokes at younger ages, and we're also more likely to have more severe strokes. So it's imperative, it's very important that we educate our community members about the risk of high blood pressure and the risk of dying from stroke. Now, I just wanted to go ahead and share a slide with you to really start talking about high blood pressure. So what is high blood pressure? Well, your blood pressure is the force. Your blood pressure is the force of blood against the walls of your artery. High blood pressure is also called hypertension. If you have high blood pressure, your heart has to pump harder than it should in order to get the blood to all of the parts of your body. So if you just go back and remember when we talked about the heart in that first session, we talked about how the heart comes into the right atrium, it flows down into the right ventricle, is pumped to the lungs through the right through the pulmonary arteries. It returns back to the heart via the pulmonary vein. Then it dumps into the left ventricle, left atrium, and then it goes down into the left ventricle and it's pumped to the rest of the body from that left ventricle. Now, blood pressure is the force that the arteries, the force of blood against the arteries. So when your heart pumps, it's going to pump that blood out to the rest of the body, and it pumps it into the arteries. And that force of the blood against the walls of the arteries, that is called your blood pressure. When that pressure is higher than it should be, and we're going to get to in just a minute what I mean by higher, then that's called hypertension. So another term for high blood pressure is hypertension. If you have high blood pressure, then that means that your heart has to pump harder than it should in order to make sure that that blood can get out to all of the parts of the body. Now, we measure blood pressure in millimeters of mercury, and you will see that as little m, capital H, little g. That little m stands for millimeters, and then that capital H, little g stands for mercury. So it's said millimeters of mercury. Now, when your heart pumps, when it squeezes real tight, that's going to lead to systolic pressure. So that's the force of the blood leaving the heart and going into the arteries. That's the higher number. And so that happens when the heart contracts, is your systolic pressure. When the heart then relaxes to allow more blood to flow into the heart, that is the diastolic pressure. And that's going to be the lower number of the two numbers. So you'll see blood pressure written as a larger number, which represents your systolic pressure, over a smaller number, which represents your diastolic pressure. And so you will see, for example, the heart rate, blood pressure written as 120/80. And we want to keep in mind that 120, that higher number, the systolic is the systolic pressure. That represents when the heart contracts. And the smaller number, the second number, is the diastolic, and it represents when the heart relaxes. So for most adults, a healthy blood pressure is usually 120/80 millimeters of mercury. If your numbers are consistently higher, you may have elevated or high blood pressure, and you may need to go on medication. You want to talk to your healthcare provider about what your numbers are and write them down. If your healthcare provider says that you have high blood pressure, ask about how you can lower it to keep it in control. Now, as I mentioned, for most adults, a healthy blood pressure is usually 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury. High blood pressure is, and the guidelines have changed. So I'm going to ask that you use the more current guidelines. The manual may say 140 over 90, but now we want to change it to state, the new guidelines state that high blood pressure starts at 130 over 139. And as you can see on this chart here, and the doctors that you work with at Mayo Clinic will share this information with you as a handout. But you will see that if you have 120 to 129 for the systolic, then that is considered elevated. And then high blood pressure or stage 1 hypertension starts at 130 to 139. So 130 to 139 is the beginning of hypertension. And if you're above 130, then you have stage 1 hypertension on the systolic side. On your diastolic, between 80 and 89 is stage 1 hypertension. So we want to use those numbers instead of the 140 over 90. Okay, so and as I mentioned, your team at Mayo Clinic will give you the handout for this new range of hypertension. If your numbers are consistently higher, you may have elevated or high blood pressure, and you may need to go on medication. We want you to talk to your provider about what your numbers are and then write them down. And your healthcare provider may recommend medication if your average systolic reading is greater than 130, or if your diastolic reading is greater than 80. Now, as we talked about, the risk of high blood pressure, high blood pressure can lead to several different complications and problems. So it's very important that we get high blood pressure treated. Individuals with high blood pressure may be at risk of having a stroke, having a heart attack, developing kidney problems, developing blindness, experiencing heart failure, and dying at younger ages. And as I mentioned earlier, African Americans are at greater risk of getting high blood pressure. High blood pressure increases your risk of developing a serious condition called congestive heart failure. Now, heart failure doesn't mean that your heart has stopped, right? If your heart has stopped, then you're looking at a situation like heart attack. But heart failure can occur where your heart is just not able to pump enough blood for you to function normally. So you can develop congestive heart failure as a result of hypertension or high blood pressure. As I said, heart failure doesn't mean that your heart has stopped beating. It's still beating, but it's just not able to pump enough blood to keep your body working the way it should work. And there is something called the ejection fraction that doctors can look at, and they can say, okay, well, if the ejection fraction is lower than it should be, then you could be in heart failure. African Americans are more likely than other racial or ethnic groups to have heart failure, to have symptoms of it at younger ages, and to die from heart failure. Now, as I mentioned before, high blood pressure is often called the silent killer because we often have no symptoms that we have it. And so it's important that we get tested, but we may not have those symptoms and it can still kill us. So high blood pressure is the main risk factor for strokes. There are other risk factors for strokes as well, and those include diabetes, heart disease, smoking, and alcohol and illicit drug use, as well as sickle cell disease. Now, these other factors can play a role in you developing stroke, and they can lead to stroke, but we know that high blood pressure or hypertension is the main risk factor for having a stroke. As we mentioned earlier, having pregnancy-related high blood pressure increases a woman's risk of having a stroke even decades after she's given birth and after their pregnancy is over. So while a woman is pregnant, she may develop high blood pressure. Again, that's called preeclampsia. After the baby is delivered, her blood pressure may return to normal, but she's still at risk of developing stroke or high blood pressure later on in life. So we want to make sure that we're educating individuals. African Americans are also twice as likely to have strokes as white, as we mentioned earlier. We're also more likely to have severe strokes. But we can lower our risk of having a stroke. Do you know anyone that has had a stroke, and what was that like for them? You might want to talk to your community members about that. Individuals may also have something called mini strokes. We might hear that term. And a mini stroke, also called a transient ischemic attack, or TIAs. And they have the same symptoms as a stroke, but they don't last as long, and they usually don't cause that brain damage. But a mini stroke is a warning sign that a stroke may be happening in the future. It's your body's telling you that, hey, there's something wrong. Sure, the symptoms of that stroke might go away, it might be short term, but you now know that, hey, I'm at risk of developing a stroke later on in the future, and I must get treatment as quickly as possible. So many strokes may last a few minutes or an entire day and then go away, but you don't want to ignore the signs. As with a heart attack, act immediately if you or someone you know has had the symptoms of a stroke or a mini stroke. Call 911 right away to get help, as this may be a serious problem that you need to take care of. So measuring blood pressure is easy and it doesn't hurt. Have yours checked at least once a year or more often if you have high blood pressure. So if the doctor has diagnosed you with high blood pressure, you need to get your blood pressure checked frequently. Your healthcare provider may ask you to check your blood pressure at home if you have a home blood pressure monitor. You may be able to also send the readings to your doctor's office electronically. Now, we encourage you to have your blood pressure checked frequently, and then to talk to your community members. You can get your blood pressure checked at the doctor's office, of course, and we encourage you to talk to your doctor about getting your blood pressure checked. But we also know that at certain CVS or other drugstores, they may have blood pressure monitors there. So that might be another area that you can talk to your community members about getting their blood pressure checked. And then we want to teach you as community health advocates about how to go out and help community members get their blood pressure checked. One of the things that we would also ask you to do as you go out and you do the training is to maybe have a list of places, clinics, hospitals available so that individuals can get help if they need it. We do encourage our community health advocates, community health workers to think about doing health fairs and participating in other activities where you might be educating or taking blood pressures. And we ask that you'll have a list of clinics or hospitals available in case you run into an individual that has elevated blood pressure so that they can get help. This is particularly important if you're helping to do with health fairs and you identify someone that's their blood pressure is very, very high. We want you to be able to refer those individuals to get immediate care because they can be at risk of having stroke. So in your manual, there is the wallet card on page 4.27. And as I mentioned earlier, we would want you to print these out and have these available to give to the community members so that they can really track where their blood pressure is, some of the other symptoms that individuals may have related to high blood pressure, and making sure that they are keeping up to date and informed about their blood pressure as well as other measurements. So we want to ask for your numbers. So each time you have your blood pressure taken, make sure that you're asking whoever is taking that blood pressure to give it to you and keep a record of it with you. Anyone who's pregnant or planning a pregnancy needs to take some extra steps to make sure that they are have a heart healthy pregnancy. So it's very important for their health and the health of their baby that they monitor their blood pressure and making sure that they're not at risk of developing preeclampsia. Now, as I had mentioned, so in your manuals, you will have those handouts. So it's important that you make copies of the handouts and give it to community members when you do the training. There is a handout on pregnancy and your health, and it would be great if you can go through this handout with your community members. The actually pregnancy and health is over 3 pages. And as we mentioned earlier, health habits to control your blood pressure include taking your blood pressure regularly. And then one of the handouts, as we can see here on page 4.31, is to take these steps and talk to your community members about taking these steps to control your blood pressure. And they include aim for a healthy weight. So try not to gain extra weight. And if you're overweight, you want to try to lose weight slowly, about 1 pound to 2 pounds every week. Be active every day for at least 30 minutes a day. So you're looking at, you want to be physically active as an adult for 2 hours and 30 minutes in a week. As we said earlier, children need at least 1 hour of physical activity per day, but you want to look at trying to get at least 30 minutes a day and working up to that. We talked about different strategies for that. Eat less salt and sodium. So you want to try to buy foods that are marked sodium free, low sodium, or reduced sodium, and then take the salt shaker away from the table. You want to eat heart healthy. So if possible, try to eat more fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and consider following the DASH diet. The DASH diet is a diet that's highly recommended by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And the Mayo Clinic staff can provide you more information about the DASH diet. You want to look at quitting smoking, and you may need to talk to your doctor about products or programs that can help you to quit smoking. You want to try to manage stress, cut back on alcohol, take your medications, and then making sure that you're getting your blood pressure checked regularly. Now, next, we're going to talk about sodium and avoiding salt in our foods, because we know that sodium or salt and salt, we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Salt and sodium are the same thing, but they're one of the products that can lead to high blood pressure. Now, so going to the manual, okay, eating foods with less salt and sodium can help you control your blood pressure. Sodium is the part of salt that affects your health. Almost all of the sodium that we eat comes in the form of salt. We often use the words salt and sodium to mean the same thing. Now, there are other salts and sodiums there are other salts on the market, but for our purposes right now, when we say salt, we mean sodium chloride, okay? If it's sea salt, what is sea salt? That's still sodium chloride. If it's salt from the earth, where a lot of salt is mined, we're talking about sodium chloride. If the salt came from the moon, it would still be sodium chloride. So for this conversation, we're going to be talking about salt, and we mean sodium chloride, okay? And one of the important parts about that is no matter where it came from, salt is still sodium chloride. So sea salt is sodium chloride, earth salt is sodium chloride, Malaysian salt is sodium chloride, salt from the moon would be sodium chloride. All of them are still the same thing, sodium chloride. And what we want to reduce is our salt intake. We want to reduce that amount of sodium chloride that we're taking in. So sea salt, when it comes to that sodium chloride, is no better than earth salt, sodium chloride. What might happen is that there might be other minerals or chemicals added in. But when we talk about salt here, we're talking about sodium chloride. And it doesn't matter if it's sea salt or Malaysian salt or wherever the salt came from, we need to reduce the amount of sodium chloride that we're taking into our bodies. Now, for some people, including African Americans, you may be more sensitive to sodium and salt than others, right? And you may need to take more care, be especially careful about how much salt we're taking in. So for African Americans, we recommend that African Americans take in no more than 1,500 milligrams of sodium, including the sodium in processed foods, in a day. So I have a valve here. I don't know if you can see it that well. I'm going to just stop sharing for a second, and then I'm going to try to change my background. Please give me just 1 second. And the reason I want to do this is because I want to be able to show you. So it is recommended that African Americans get about 1,500 milligrams of salt a day. So I know it's difficult for you to see, but that's about this amount of salt in this test tube. Okay, 1,500 milligrams of salt a day. Now, unfortunately, most people in the United States are getting a lot more than that. And what we can see is that individuals, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. What we can see is that for the most part, most Americans, you should only be getting 1,500 milligrams of salt a day, but most Americans are getting 3,400 milligrams of salt a day. So this is what we should be taking in a day, but unfortunately, we're taking in more than twice as much in a day. And when we talk to our community members, we want to get that message across that we're taking in more sodium than we need to be taking in, more than twice as much as we need to be taking in. So our recommended amount of salt is 1,500 milligrams per day, but unfortunately, the average American is getting 3,400 milligrams a day. So as I was just saying, you know, we want to encourage our community members to take in, they only need about 1,500 milligrams of salt a day, but unfortunately, most Americans are getting 3,400 milligrams of salt a day. So we're getting more than twice as much of the salt than we should. And when I was there and I did this program in person, you know, what you want to be able to demonstrate to your community members is that over time, that's adding up as well. So whereas we should be taking in 1,500 milligrams a day, we're taking in 3,400 milligrams a day, the average American. And in a week, you know, there's a cumulative effect. So instead of the amount that we should have taken in a week, we're taking in more than twice as much than we should. And it's adding up. And then in a month, the same thing. So we're doubling, even over the periods of time, the amount of salt that we should be taking in. And we want to point out to our community members that cumulative effect is really putting us at risk of high blood pressure and of dying from a stroke. Now you just want to be able to share with your community members, you know, how much salt we're taking in. And we know that it's too much salt, and really bringing attention to that. So going back to the manual, then, I wanted to just share this with us. So let's talk about what foods are high in sodium. So more than 2/3 of the sodium we eat come from processed and restaurant foods. So we want to try as much as possible to avoid those processed or restaurant foods, because there we can't really tell in some cases, like in a restaurant, how much food is being added to our how much salt is being added to our food. We don't know. We have to depend on someone else, that chef. And hey, I don't want to discourage you totally from going to restaurants. I know that, you know, we tend to go to restaurants to meet friends, to socialize, to do other things. But even in the restaurant, we want to be able to make sure that we're kind of tracking how much salt and sodium that we're taking in. So it's important to realize that more than 2/3 of the salt and sodium come from that processed foods and from restaurant foods. And so some of these foods are often very high in sodium, and they can include prepared meats such as bologna and hot dogs and other prepared meats. They can include packaged rice and pasta dishes. They can include pizzas. So pizzas can have high levels of salt in it, not only in that cheese, but also in the dough and the tomato sauce and in other components of the pizza. There's high salt content that might be in those frozen dinners that we have, the Stouffer's dinners, in our salad dressings, seasoning, and sauces, and then also in our soup. So we want to be able to make sure that we're doing what? That we're reading our food labels, right? We covered reading our food labels in a previous session. We want to make sure that we're looking at our food labels and we're understanding what our food labels is telling us about the amount of salt and sodium that we're consuming in those foods. So right now we're going to go read some tips to avoid sodium, and have many of these to do already. So we want to, step one, help our community members understand how to read the food labels and to choose foods that are lower in sodium, choose those reduced sodium foods or no salt added foods. We want to try, when possible, to eat fresh, frozen, or no salt added foods. Now, foods that are in cans, they're going to be higher in sodium. The reason that they can sit there for years on the shelf is that sodium has been added to it. Salt has been added to it to help preserve those foods. So when possible, and when you talk to your community members, you want to stress that it's important to figure out how to get access to fresh, frozen, or no salt added foods instead of those pre-seasoned or processed meats, poultry, and vegetables, those canned foods. Try not to use pre-made sauces, mixes, or instant products, such as rice noodles and ready-made pastas. Rinse food. So we know that our community members at times, they will have to shop at the grocery store and get canned foods. It's just an unfortunate fact of life that everybody may not have access to fresh or frozen foods. Fresh or frozen foods are those foods that we want to try to encourage our communities members to eat and to have, because they're going to be lower in sodium. But we recognize that not everybody has that access, and what they may have is those canned string beans, those canned other canned foods in their pantry, and that's what they use. But then what we want to do is encourage them to rinse the food out, right? Wash away that salt. Just quickly rinse the salt. And don't pour it right into the container to cook. You want to rinse the can out, the food out first, inside the can, to make sure you're getting rid of that excess salt. You want to try to eat at home as much as possible, as we just mentioned. Eating out, you don't really have that control over how much salt is in your food. So when possible, eat at home often so you can make your food from scratch. Don't use salt when you're cooking pasta, rice, or hot cereals, and try to use herbs and spices. You can use things like thyme and rosemary and cilantro and other herbs and spices that are not that salt, that are not that sodium chloride. So try to use them as much as possible, and then try to eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. So really, as I said earlier, looking at that DASH diet. Now, here you have a thing of ramen noodles. And so I encourage you to have, now this is a different brand. I'm in Canada. I looked for ramen noodles. I couldn't find ramen noodles. In the US, you can probably find ramen noodles, but the concept is the same. And we have these top package of noodles here, right? And so we're not trying to tell our community members, hey, don't eat noodles, right? We want to make sure we're reading our food labels, and you can see right here, the package. I know you probably cannot read it, but it gives you, make sure that you're teaching your community members to read the food label. But when we're talking about ramen noodles, then the thing is, I'm not trying to discourage you from eating ramen noodles, but where is the salt in the ramen noodles? Well, we know that the salt in the ramen noodles is all coming from the salt pack, right? The salt pack is where the salt is in the ramen noodles. So what you can talk to your community members about is, hey, still have that ramen noodles. We know that ramen noodles are cheap. They can give some nutrients, but then throw away the salt pack, right? don't use the salt pack, throw that out, and then just use the noodles and season the noodles with different things. Like I was mentioning earlier, you can use thyme, you can use rosemary, oregano. There are other spices that you can use instead of salt and instead of using that salt pack. So definitely educate your community members about strategies that will help them to avoid the salt. Now, going back to the manual, and I'm going to share my screen again. So we want to try to eat foods that are high in potassium. There is some risk to eating more potassium, you know, and you need to talk to your doctor because of your kidney function. You know, that might be something that they need to take into account if you're going to eat salts that are higher in potassium. But according to the manual, so eat foods that are high in potassium to help reduce the effects of sodium on your blood pressure. A wide variety of foods are rich in potassium, including dried apricots, orange juice, acorn squash, potatoes, spinach, tomatoes, broccoli. I'm a big fan of broccoli. I used to not be a fan of broccoli when I was younger, but now if you steam them just right, not too long, but you want to steam them some, oh, it's wonderful. Lentils, kidney beans, soybeans, and nuts. You want to try to use salt substitutes. So as I was mentioning earlier, when we talk about salt in this program, we're meaning sodium chloride. They do sell a product now. If you go to the grocery store, you might see something like no salt or some of these salt substitutes. And those salt substitutes are going to be potassium chloride or maybe even magnesium chloride. And yes, I do want to say to you, hey, you want to consider those things, but you also want to talk to your doctor first, because if you have problems with your kidneys, for example, it may not be a good idea to take in a lot of potassium. But that's something that you want to talk to your doctor about. So if you have diabetes, kidney disease, or heart disease, you want to make sure you're talking to your healthcare provider before using some of these salt substitutes, particularly the potassium chloride, because there may be reasons for you to avoid potassium. So this is page 4.32. And here you want to teach your community members how to read the food labels, right? We want to make sure that you give this handout so that you can help individuals read the food labels. Food labels tell you what you need to know about the foods that you're choosing to eat and how to choose foods that are lower in sodium. So here's a food label from a package of noodles that we just went over. We will see that first it gives you your serving size and number of servings. So that's where you want to start with your food label. At the very top is going to give you the serving size and the numbers of servings. Now, that oodles and noodles that I was just I'm showing you know, you may think that, well, one serving size is one package. But then if you look at this, there's actually 2 servings in this container. So one of these oodles and noodles is actually 2 servings, right? So what that means is that we're going to have to double everything that we read here. So it's not 160 calories. That's 160 calories per serving. But this pack of oodles and noodles, and the one that I have, I think it says it's one serving is one package. So it could say different things. But you may also see, and I know that you can't see it, but my package of oodles and noodles, they've already doubled the calories, right? So whereas it says here that one serving is half a block, mine says one serving is one package, but mine also says that the calories from this pack of oodles and noodles is 460, whereas yours is saying it's 160. And if you double the 160, then you're getting to 320, right? So the amount of calories in this isn't 160. You got to double it because you look at the serving size, and you can see that actually, well, hey, this serving size of oodles and noodles has 320 calories. So as we move down, we're now going to have to double everything, right? Because we know that this package of oodles and noodles there's actually 2 servings in the container. And you won't see most people break it in half or serve themselves half the salt packet. They're usually going to put the whole pack of oodles and noodles in there. They're going to use the whole package of salt. So they would have to then double it, right? As I mentioned, the serving size is half a block of oodles and noodles. The package contains 2 serving sizes. So now we have to remember the numbers are on the label for one serving size, not a whole package, right? The amount per serving. So now we'll come down and we'll say amount per serving. We've already realized that if we eat this whole package, we have to double everything by 2. So how much fat is in this? Well, it's not 7 grams now, right? We have to double it. It's actually 14 grams, right? How much saturated fat? It's not 3. It's actually 6 grams of saturated fat. But what we want to come down to is this number right here. We're looking at the sodium. And in this one package of oodles and noodles, one serving has 710 milligrams of salt, right? One serving has 710 milligrams of salt. Now, I told you earlier that we want to aim for less than 1,500 milligrams. So by eating this package, this one package of oodles and noodles, keeping in mind we have to double this, we're already eating 1,420 milligrams. If I want you to stay at 1,500 milligrams, but you've already eaten 1,410 in this one package of oodles and noodles, well, that doesn't leave you a lot for the rest of the day. So what we want to do is we want to teach our community members to read their food labels and make smarter choices. So as I mentioned, though, with this pack of oodles and noodles, the good news is that the salt is in the salt package. There is some salt in the noodles themselves that you're not going to be able to get rid of unless you just don't eat the oodles and noodles. But the salt package is where the majority of the salt is in the oodles. The seasoned package is where the most of it is. So we want to be able to tell our community members about that. Now, the one thing I do want to go over before we move on is the percent daily value. And you want to kind of think of percent daily value as a budget, right? So you're going to have $100, right? Let's say $100 to spend. If you spent 31%, and now that's 31% for one serving size, we know that there are 2 serving sizes in this package. So it's actually 62. If we spend $62 or 62% on one item, that only leaves us with $48 to spend. That only leaves us with 48 units in our budget, right? So looking at percent daily value, you want to try to get 100% or less of some of these things. I want to have lower amounts of fat, and I want to have lower amounts of salt. Well, I'm already getting with my percent daily value 62% of the sodium that I need for the day in this one meal. So our percent daily value, we want to choose items that are less than 5% where possible. We know that in many circumstances that may be difficult, but we want to try to at least stay below 20%. 5% or less is low, but 20% or more is high. So we want to try to choose those foods that have less than 20% of our percent daily value for this. And then, of course, our nutrient, here's the amount of sodium in one serving is listed in milligrams, okay? So now you want to go over these food label activities with your group, right? And so which of one of these foods would we choose would be lower in sodium? Here we have reduced sodium soup, right? And so we can see that the salt content for this it's 430 milligrams in this soup. So one serving of low sodium soup has 340 milligrams of soup. Of course, you got to look at your serving size. So if you're eating a whole bowl, that may be more than the serving size. So make sure you look at your serving size. But it only has 19% of our percent daily value. So we want to stay below 20. Choosing this soup, then, the low sodium soup, would be better than the package of noodles that we just went over that had 710 milligrams or 31%. So that one pack of soup, of oodles and noodles, has that 730, and we're just talking about a half a block there. So, actually, when considering our serving sizes, we know it's going to be a lot more. But the soup is a better choice, and we know it's a better choice because we read our food labels. So moving on with activities in the manual, make sure you give the handout to participants. we want to look at several different choices that Darnell has to make. During a recent visit to a healthcare provider, Darnell learned that he has high blood pressure. The provider told him to cut back on the amount of sodium he eats. Use your food labels. We want to teach our community members to use the food labels to choose foods that are better for us. And so we have this tomato juice. First, we're going to look at the serving size. Now, in this container, there are 8 servings per container. Now, I imagine that this is a larger item here. It might be a 2-liter or a larger container. Most people are not going to drink this whole thing of fruit juice, but it does have 8 servings in it. Now, how much though is in what is one serving size? We can see here that one serving size is 8 fluid ounces. Okay, so we want to be able to measure that out, 8 fluid ounces. But in that one serving size of tomato juice, we can see that there are 40 calories. That's good. But in terms of salt, there is 630 milligrams of salt in 8 ounces of this tomato juice. That's quite a bit. And we can see here that it's 27, right? If we look at orange juice, on the other hand, we can see that this orange juice, again, is in a larger container. You might have a larger container of orange juice. We don't anticipate that someone's going to drink the whole container of orange juice. They could. If they did drink the whole container of orange juice, we would have to multiply everything here by 8, since there's 8 servings there. But we're going to assume that they're just going to have an 8-ounce glass of orange juice. We can see that there's 120 calories. So there is more calories in this orange juice, and we'll go over in a minute where those calories are. But what we care about most right now is the amount of sodium. And we can see that there's only 5 milligrams of sodium in this orange juice. Only 5 milligrams of sodium. That's compared to 630 milligrams of sodium in this tomato juice. Now, we do encourage you to look at other parts of the food label. You're going to have to measure, hey, or think about, what's important to me, because this orange juice has a lot more sugar than the tomato juice. We can see that the orange juice has 29 grams of sugar, 21 grams of total sugar, whereas the tomato juice only has 6 grams of sugar. There are going to be times where where community members will have to make a choice. Well, what's more important to me? Am I trying to watch how much sugar I'm taking in, or am I trying to watch how much salt I'm taking in? And they're going to have to weigh what their situation is at the time. If I have diabetes, this orange juice may not be the best choice for me. But here we're talking about sodium, so the orange juice would be a better choice for me from a sodium standpoint, because it only has 5 milligrams of sodium, whereas this tomato juice has 630. We can look at the herb roasted chicken versus the barbecue chicken. So which one should Darnell choose? Again, looking at our serving size. So one serving size is 1 container. This might be like 1 piece of chicken, right? And 3 ounces of chicken. So one serving size here is 1 container. So now we don't have to multiply anything. We know that the serving size is this container. This one serving has 150 calories, whereas the herb roasted chicken has 140 calories. So barbecue chicken is 140. The herb roasted chicken is the barbecue chicken is 150. The herb roasted chicken is 140. But what we're caring about right now is the sodium content. And we can see that this barbecue chicken has 450 milligrams of sodium, whereas the herb roasted chicken only has 30 milligrams. So the herb roasted chicken would be our better choice here. You can move on. You can see frozen peas. The frozen peas only have 45 milligrams of salt or sodium, whereas the canned peas has 310, right? So the canned foods are going to have more salt in them than the frozen foods. But again, we have to recognize that some of our community members may not have access to the frozen peas. They may only have access to canned peas. What we want to instruct our community members to do is wash the peas out before they cook it. Wash away the sodium. Wash the can out of peas before you use it, to get rid of that excess sodium. The food label has the serving size and number of servings in the container. It also gives you the amount of calories, sodium, saturated fat, and cholesterol in one serving. We'll talk about calories, saturated fat, and cholesterol in the next session. The percent daily value can help you compare products. It tells you if a food is high or low in various nutrients. Remember, it's easier than you might think to have too much sodium in a day. Remember, we want you to have 1,500 milligrams of sodium in a day. Most Americans are getting 3,400 or more milligrams of sodium in a day. So it's important that we look for those foods that are lower in sodium. Choose foods that are lower with your percent daily value for sodium. A percent daily value of 5 or less is low. That's good. That's where we want to be. Whereas a percent daily value of 20 or more is high. Once you get into the habit of looking at the food labels, it becomes easier for you and your community members to do. We just looked at the activity. The percent daily value of sodium in the package of noodles, as we saw earlier, was circled on the food label. The sodium content of the same types of food can vary depending on how the food was packaged and processed and made. So we want to make sure that we're reading our food labels. Look at the bottom of the handout on that page that we gave, and then you'll see the percent daily value of the sodium in the soup was lower than it was in the noodles. So we want to make sure we're helping our community members read the food labels. As I had mentioned earlier, you want to think of percent daily value like a budget, right? You have a daily budget of $100 for all of your sodium needs in a day. If you were to spend $34, 34% on one serving, then that serving has cost you more than 1/3 of your budget for that day. That's okay for a whole meal, but it's not if you're just looking at, hey, one serving size. And so you want to make sure that you're teaching your community members about that. I did speak earlier about the DASH diet. And then the DASH, of course, it stands for Dietary Approaches to Stopping Hypertension. This is the diet that was developed by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. It recommends having more fruits and vegetables, eating fat-free or low-fat milk products, whole grain foods, fish, poultry, or lean meats. And we're going to talk a little bit later in one of the next session. I'm not telling you to don't eat meat, right? I was asked earlier about, hey, well, what about pork? And what we're saying is to look for those leaner meats. Look for the less fatty meats, because we're going to learn in the next sessions about avoiding saturated fat. And then also it recommends nuts and seeds. It also recommends limiting your amount of salt, sodium, sweets, sweetened drinks, fats, and oils. The DASH menus and recipes are lower in sodium than people normally eat. They provide about 2,300 milligrams of sodium a day. Keep in mind, we want African Americans to eat even less than that. But the recipe also comes with an option for people who are trying to limit their amount of sodium to that 1,500 milligrams per day. We want to make sure that we're choosing foods that are lower in salt and sodium, and that may help us to prevent high blood pressure. Eating fruits and vegetables, using fat-free or low-fat milk products, and avoiding fatty foods may also help us to lower our blood pressure. Some people don't like milk products or have a problem digesting lactose, and so for them, you want to look for lactose-free products. We have so many more products on the market now around soy or oat, so you can look for different options now than previous. And we went over Darnell's choices for the foods. So we want to look at making sure that we're helping individuals to read their food labels. And there is in the manual herb spice on page 349. I'm just going to check that out. 4.39. I think it's right, actually. Yes. So these are some of the options that we can use instead of salt. I had mentioned earlier that you still want to look at your food, but you can use things like basil, cayenne pepper, celery seed, chili powder. I mentioned cilantro earlier. I also mentioned, I believe, oregano, thyme. You got sage here. You have rosemary. So you don't have to always use salt to flavor your foods, and we want to teach our community members about using other things to help flavor your food. Now, our last point is about alcohol, right? Drinking too much alcohol can also raise your blood pressure. It can also harm your liver, your brain, and your heart. Now, often, you talk about alcohol and people say, well, I heard that wine is good for me, so should not be drinking wine. And the answer to that is no. The question is, what is it that's good about the wine that can help you? And there's a chemical that's in grapes, right? So you don't have to drink the wine to get the benefit. You can eat the grapes. And actually, eating the grapes are better for you than drinking the wine, because you also get that fiber. So we want to think about strategies to reduce our alcohol intake, because we know that alcohol can be bad for us. It can raise our blood pressure, and it can do other things. So we want to try to avoid consuming too much alcohol. If you don't drink alcohol, then don't start. As I mentioned earlier, there are other ways to get the benefits of red wine, in particular, eating grapes. Pregnant women shouldn't drink alcohol at all. There's no safe alcohol consumption amount for pregnant women, because you can develop a condition called fetal alcohol syndrome. If you drink alcohol, then try to drink moderate amounts, right? I want you to focus on only drinking moderate amount if you drink alcohol. Men should have no more than 2 drinks a day, and women should have no more than 1 drink a day. So what do you think counts for a drink? We can look here. So 1 drink is a 12-ounce beer. So for men, you can have two drinks a day. That would be 12 ounces of beer. This is about 5% alcohol. So some beers and malts may have more alcohol than that. You might need to read your food label to see how much alcohol in that. Regular beer is about 150 calories, whereas light beers are only 100 calories. Or a serving size is 5 ounces of wine. This is about 12% alcohol, or 100 calories, or 1.5 ounces of liquor. So these are our amounts of serving sizes. And as we said, men should have no more than 2 drinks a day, and women should only have 1 drink a day. So a woman, only 1 can of beer, only 5 ounces of wine, or only 1.5 ounces of liquor. Men can have 2, as we mentioned earlier. Now, if you have high blood pressure, making the lifestyle changes that we discussed may not always be enough. You want to make sure you're talking to your doctor about it. And, the question may come up is, hey, if I've been diagnosed with high blood pressure, well, can I just change my habits? Can I just live a healthier lifestyle? We want to make sure that you're talking to your doctor about that. And there have been situations where individuals have been able to lower their blood pressure with just changes in their diet, with exercising, and with doing those other recommendations. But that doesn't work for most people. Most people, the majority of people, if they have high blood pressure, the fact is that they may have to start taking medications. And so what we want to do is we want to educate our community members that if they do have to start taking medication, then the proper things to do in that regard. We want to make sure that they're taking their medication exactly as the healthcare provider tells them to, even if they feel well. So if an individual has been diagnosed with high blood pressure, and they'll start taking their medication, and their medication may bring their blood pressure down to that 120/80, but they still need to continue to take the medication, because that medication is what's keeping their blood pressure down. If they stop the medication, then their blood pressure is going to probably go back up again. Tell their healthcare provider the names of the medications that they're taking, including any prescription medications from other providers, non-prescription medications. So we know that there are some medications, particularly cold medications, or some of those seasonal medications that people take during the winter, NyQuil or others, that can interact with blood pressure medication. So if you're taking over-the-counter medication, you want to make sure you're telling your doctor about that. And then bringing all of your medications in with you. Also, if you're taking any herbs or supplements at home, you know, I take quite a few supplements. I'm now an older African American individual, so I do take things like vitamin D. I take magnesium. I take zinc, and I take other over-the-counter vitamins and supplements. So you want to make sure you're telling your doctor that these are the things I'm taking. All of it is important because they can interact or have a different outcome depending on the medications that you're taking. Tell your provider right away if any medications make you feel sick or strange. If you feel lightheaded after taking your medication, make sure that you're talking to your doctor about that. Make sure that you're refilling your prescription before you run out of the medication. And I'll admit, I take a medication for sickle cell disease called hydroxyurea. And there have been times when I would try to run low, but it's important that we keep track of our medications and that we're getting the refills as we need them, particularly if you have high blood pressure, or you have diabetes. It's important to make sure that you're staying vigilant about refilling your medications. Have your blood pressure checked often, and to see that the medication is working for you. And don't stop taking your medication if you have high blood pressure. You want to make sure you're talking and you're working with your doctors. And then make sure that you do know your numbers. For most adults, as we mentioned earlier, a healthy blood pressure is between 120 over 80, but below 120 over 80. If your blood pressure is 130 or above, that's hypertension. You're in stage 1 hypertension. If it's diastolic is greater than 80, if between greater than 80, that's stage 1 hypertension. So we want to make sure that we're taking the information and writing that information down. So we've covered all of this, and then in the manual is a soul food makeover. Make sure that you're educating your community members about the different options. And there are things that you can do. You know, you can invite and have cooking demonstrations in your neighborhood to show members of the community that foods that are made lower in salt, but using things like cilantro, oregano, thyme, and those other herbs we talked about can be just as tasty. So consider having a food demonstration in your neighborhood. So quickly, just to review the points that we discussed today in this session, we talked about what blood pressure is, and blood pressure is the force of blood against the walls of the artery. We talked about what a normal blood pressure is, and a normal blood pressure is below 120 over 80. That's what we want to keep our blood pressure at, below 120 over 80. 130 and higher for systolic is high blood pressure. Greater than 80 systolic, diastolic is high blood pressure. So we want to make sure that we're educating our community members about that. If your numbers are consistently higher, you may have elevated or high blood pressure. You want to talk to your healthcare provider about what your numbers mean for you. So why is blood pressure dangerous? High blood pressure can lead to a heart attack, stroke, kidney problems, eye problems, and dying at early ages. So we want to make sure that we are helping our community members live longer. The ABC model is that every grandchild should know their grandparents. And unfortunately, too many African Americans are dying at early ages from high blood pressure, from diabetes, and other cardiovascular diseases. So we want to make sure that we're getting this information out so that individuals can live longer to know their grandchildren. What can you do to help make your blood pressure medicines work better? Eat more fruits and vegetables. Cut back on the salt and sodium. So we talked about that. Try to lose weight and be more physically active. Take your medication as your healthcare provider has explained it to you, and then talk to your provider about the side effects. What are strokes? So we talked about a stroke happens when the blood vessels in the brain are blocked or get clogged, and then you have brain tissue that's starting to die. Very similar to a heart attack, right? So strokes are often called brain attacks, and they're very serious and can disable or kill you. How can you prevent your high blood pressure? Be more physically active, eat healthy, don't smoke, watch your weight and limit your alcohol intake, control your stress, and then making sure that you're checking your blood pressure. If your healthcare provider has prescribed medicines for high blood pressure, then making sure that you're taking it. So that ends our session on session 4, high blood pressure. Thank you so much for being in this session. And I look forward to speaking more to you in the next section. Thank you.